What is one human life worth? What about a human death? In today's video we explore 3 peculiar but true cases of consensual murder, where the line between killing a person and helping them to die becomes precariously thin. We find out what happens when a motivational speaker's quest for death leads him to the unforgiving backstreets of Harlem, and when one man's fascination with the dark taboo of cannibalism drives him to seek out his ultimate fate in the recesses of the dark web. And finally, what happens when one woman's desperation pushes her to orchestrate her own violent demise? Twice. Hello and welcome to the Little Shop of Crime. My name is Steve, and in store today is something a little different. I've curated 3 very distinct cases which all have something in common. The victim gave their killer permission to murder them. And I'm not talking about euthanasia, I mean violently, and each for a different reason. Anyway, there's loads to get through, so I won't keep you. This is case number 1. Motivated to murder. The first of our trio of tragic tales begins on Long Island, in the prosperous neighbourhood of Woodmere. There lived a man named Jeffrey Locker. Jeffrey was a successful businessman turned motivational speaker. Co-author of a popular self-help book, he toured the country giving talks on how to handle workplace stress. According to his own website, he was a philanthropist dedicated to bringing spirituality into the business world. And at 52, he appeared to have it all. Money, a large house in an affluent neighbourhood, a loving wife and 3 children. But on a warm Wednesday night in July of 2009, the phone rang inside his suburban home. His wife picked up. Jeffrey was calling to let her know he'd be late home. He had a flat tyre. She needn't worry though, because a nice young couple were helping him. But several more hours passed and still there was no sign of Jeffrey. His wife called the police to report him missing. The following morning, however, New York City police discovered his 2007 Dodge Magnum parked outside a city housing project in East Harlem. There was no evidence there was ever a flat tyre, but they did find Jeffrey. His bloodied body was in the driver's seat, his hands bound behind his back with an electrical cord. A medical examiner would later conclude that Jeffrey Locker had been murdered. His cause of death was 6 stab wounds, very close together in the centre of his chest, which had punctured his heart, lungs and liver. His ATM card was conspicuously missing from his wallet. It was pretty clear to police that he was the victim of a violent botched robbery. It was something they'd seen countless times before. A person in New York City who'd found himself in the wrong place at the wrong time. The next step was to try to determine what had brought a guy like Jeffrey Locker to the backstreets of East Harlem. And they weren't short of possible explanations. News agencies picked up the story in no time, and rumours and speculation began to swirl. Maybe it was a drug deal gone bad, a brutal gang initiation, or perhaps he'd crossed the wrong business associate. But the most tantalising lead came from a witness who allegedly saw Jeffrey in a nearby deli at 3 AM that same morning, buying condoms. Detectives now believed he'd been in the neighbourhood looking for a sex worker. But those who knew Jeffrey scoffed. He was a devoted husband, and they found no evidence to back up this theory. Besides, they wouldn't have to wait very long for real answers. A surveillance camera captured grainy images of a man entering and leaving Jeffrey's car around the time he was believed to have been killed. It wasn't a lot to go on, but the detectives would soon receive a call from Jeffrey's bank about that missing ATM card. It had been used at 5 separate locations in the hours after his death. Somebody had withdrawn $1,100 from his account, and each transaction was captured on CCTV. It was the same man who'd been in Jeffrey's car. Police gathered the footage together and had stills printed, and it wasn't long before somebody recognised the man as 36-year-old Kenneth Minor. Kenneth was a husband, a father, and an unemployed computer technician. The 6'4" man was known to police, but his rap sheet consisted of drugs violations and a robbery. Nothing like this. From the beginning though, there was no denial from Kenneth that he'd been involved in Jeffrey's death. But nobody, not even the veteran detectives, expected what came next. Kenneth Minor's bizarre excuse. Jeffrey had apparently approached him on East Harlem's 2nd Avenue with a chilling proposition. He wanted to purchase a gun. When asked why, he replied, "Because I want you to shoot me." He then offered to pay him in cash to end his life. Kenneth asked why he didn't just jump into the nearby Harlem River. It wouldn't work, Jeffrey told him. He couldn't end his own life, nor could he risk trying to make it look like an accident. He wanted to pay Kenneth to kill him violently and stage it as a robbery so that his family could get millions of dollars in life insurance money. Initially, Kenneth wasn't interested, but he did tell Jeffrey he'd get the gun for $60. He took the money with no intention of doing so. Instead, he just bought some drugs. But when they ran out, he gave Jeffrey a call. He thought he could finagle a few more dollars out of him. He got into the car just as Jeffrey was making a phone call to his wife, the very same call during which he lied about the flat tire. Then the two men just sat and talked for a while. Jeffrey told him he'd hit a little financial trouble after getting caught up in some Ponzi scheme. According to Kenneth, Jeffrey practically begged him to do it. He said he was broke and desperate, and it was getting done one way or another. And so he tied Jeffrey's hands behind his back and tried to strangle him with telephone wire. But that kept on breaking. Eventually, Jeffrey nodded towards the glove compartment. Inside was a knife. But according to Kenneth, he didn't actually stab Jeffrey. He just held the knife against the steering wheel, and the desperate man lunged forwards onto it 4 times. Jeffrey told him to move the knife across a little to where his heart was. Then he thrust onto it twice more. Kenneth said that when he left, Jeffrey was still clinging to life. His ATM card and PIN were payment for the assistance. Why he made no effort to disguise his face when using them, that's anybody's guess. Investigators grilled Kenneth Miner for 10 hours. He fully admitted to the part he played, but insisted it wasn't murder for hire, just one person helping another. He just happened to be the building Jeffrey jumped from. But the detectives didn't believe a word of this ridiculous account. A man perusing the streets of New York looking to purchase a hitman for himself? It was unheard of. They saw it as nothing but a far-fetched story, formulated in a desperate attempt to cover up what was nothing but a botched robbery. Nevertheless, they needed to disprove him, and so they looked into Jeffrey's life to see if he really did have recent money troubles. And it turned out he was swimming in debt. His business was struggling, and his dwindling income could no longer support the flashy lifestyle and hefty mortgage. On top of this, he was being sued for over $120,000 from profits he'd made from that infamous Ponzi scheme run by Lou Pearlman, the boy band impresario. Jeffrey Locker denied the allegations but was on the verge of declaring bankruptcy. Kenneth Miner was also right about the life insurance. Jeffrey had taken out millions of dollars worth of policies in the months before. The total value of his death was somewhere between $12 and $18 million. Police also took a good look at his computer, and they discovered a series of clues that suggested Jeffrey had been contemplating his deadly escape plan for some time. He'd been researching funeral arrangements and had even emailed his wife about how to access and manage any assets he would leave behind upon his death. Kenneth Miner's implausible story was starting to look a lot more believable. And as it happened, he wasn't the first person Jeffrey had asked for help. A witness came forward, Melvin Fleming, a homeless man. He told the same story of Jeffrey Locker's fatal proposal to the one that Kenneth Miner had already told police. But unlike Kenneth, he just conned the man out of $7,000 and fled. The detectives now fully accepted that Jeffrey Locker had solicited his own murder. The trial began in February of 2011 and lasted 3 weeks. Kenneth Miner's attorney offered a manslaughter plea, which carried a maximum sentence of 15 years. The prosecution rejected it. Though they accepted that Jeffrey Locker had wanted to die, they insisted Kenneth Miner's involvement nonetheless amounted to murder. And that's what it came down to, a case of assisted suicide versus murder for money, and whether Kenneth really did just hold the knife against the steering wheel or if he actively stabbed Jeffrey. And on that issue, the defense called to the stand Dr. Cyril Wecht, one of the world's most renowned pathologists. Dr. Wecht testified that he saw nothing that was physically, forensically, or scientifically inconsistent with Kenneth Miner's version of events. In fact, he said it was plausible, based on the clustered pattern of injuries, adding, "When someone is trying to get away, they twist and turn so the wounds are spread out." But it was irrelevant to the prosecution. They said that even just holding the knife amounted to active participation, and regardless of the method of execution, they maintained that Kenneth killed for cash, not for compassion. Kenneth's attorney, though, reminded the courtroom that Jeffrey Locker ultimately got what he wanted, and in doing so he'd actually taken advantage of Kenneth, a pawn in his carefully orchestrated death. But the lead prosecutor rejected this. In powerful closing statements, he turned to the jury and said, "Do you really want to equate what Mr. Miner did to giving a pill to a dying loved one to stop their suffering? Don't dignify this by calling it assisted suicide. Is the defendant the angel of mercy? No, he's the Grim Reaper. It was an explosive court case that had challenged the boundaries between mercy killing and murder. But even if the legal boundary wasn't clear, the moral one was. Kenneth Minor should have said no. And after 4 hours of deliberation, a jury found him guilty of murder in the 2nd degree. He addressed the court in an incredibly emotional speech.
First, I would like to say that my condolences to the Locker family, because a loss is a loss. I wanted nothing but a resolution for this case since the beginning. My life ended that night. Only 2 people in the world know what happened that night. And one of them is not here no more. But he did not want this for me to lose the rest of my life. I gotta explain this to my kids, why they won't see me for 25 years. In the end, Mr. Locke is where he wanted to be. I can't take that back now. I ask Your Honor to waive my surcharge, for I'm destitute. Sentence me to a flat sentence so that I could try to make it home before I'm a senior citizen.
As the New York Times put it, every day in the Manhattan criminal courthouse, convicted murderers are sentenced to hard time for taking the lives of people who never asked to die. Kenneth Minor got 20 years to life for killing a man who did. His conviction was overturned in 2014 after the Supreme Court determined the judge had misinterpreted the New York laws around assisted suicide and ultimately misled the jury. Opting not to face a retrial, Kenneth Minor instead chose a 1st-degree manslaughter plea deal and was instead sentenced to 12 years with reductions for time served. But where is he now? Well, he was paroled in 2019, and he occasionally holds talks to educate and share his experiences from the crime in an effort to give back, and hopefully prevent others from making similar mistakes. As for Jeffrey Locker's family, whether they knew about his dark plans was never determined for certain. But one thing is for sure, they were unable to get their hands on millions of dollars of his life insurance money, since it turned out he'd lied about his income when filling out the paperwork. And that's the story of the end of the life of Jeffrey Locker. Whether you believe it was assisted suicide or opportunistic murder, you have to admit, for a man who made a living teaching others how to handle stress, his end was as ironic as it was tragic. Now in this next case, the consent to kill comes not from desperation, but from depravity. It explores how desire can become so all-consuming that it overrides the will to survive. Case number 2. Dinner is severed. Our next story begins here, in the northern German city of Hanover, home to a little over 500,000 people. And in 2013, one of those people was 59-year-old businessman Wojciech Stempniewicz. Born in Poland, Wojciech had one daughter and had lived in Germany for over 20 years, where he'd managed to build a successful trucking and logistics company. He and his fiancée had been busy making wedding plans, that is until November 4th, when he vanished without explanation. Both Wojciech's fiancée and business partner reported him missing, and a week later, investigators checked his computer for clues. This is when his disturbing secrets emerged. It turned out he'd been frequenting a sinister site in a sordid corner of the dark web. Zambian Meat was a website dedicated to cannibalist fetishism, and described itself as the #1 site for exotic meat. It boasted 3,000 registered users who used its forums to share their fantasies around the consumption of human flesh. According to the investigators, 99% of users satisfied their urges simply by exchanging information, and these desires remained within the confines of fantasy. Wojciech went by the username Hesler Longpig, Longpig being an historic euphemism for consumed human flesh. He posted extensively about his dark desire to be eaten. In fact, it seems he'd fantasized about being murdered and cannibalized since his youth. But now it went beyond imagination. He yearned to literally be consumed. In fact, on Zambian Meat's message forum, he'd checked a box which offered to take the experience beyond fantasy. I'm not sure how the logistics of that work really, since the only outcome of that is death, so there isn't much of a payoff for him. Maybe it's the anticipation, I don't know. But it turned out that for the past year he'd been trawling the dark web in search of somebody willing to eat him. Investigators began to follow Wojciech's trail of electronic communication. They discovered that 1 month before he vanished, he'd begun speaking with another man. This man went by the username Caligula 31, named after the tyrannical Roman emperor notorious for his cruelty. On Zambian Meat, Caligula 31 advertised himself as a human butcher, and he'd made several attempts to set up real-world meetings with other users, but it seemed that no one had wanted to play out the fantasies in reality, until he connected with Wojciech. They were the perfect match, since this man's desires revolved around killing and eating people. Over the past month, the two men spoke extensively, online and by telephone and text messages. In one message, Wojciech begged, "Kill me and eat me up." There was an email chain with the subject Schlachtfest, which translates literally as Slaughter Festival, a traditional German festival which involves slaughtering and feasting upon a pig. They spoke about meeting in the flesh, so to speak. And in the end they'd set a date, November 4th, the day of Wojciech's disappearance. At this point, you might be thinking that this case sounds familiar, and that's because it bears a remarkable similarity to the infamous case of Armin Maives. And if you know about the depravities of that story, you have a pretty good idea where this one is heading. But who exactly was Caligula 31? Investigators traced the account holder to a man named Detlev Guenzel. Detlev lived in eastern Germany and was a 55-year-old divorcee and father to 3 adult children. Despite his online persona, the soft-spoken man was far from a modern-day Caligula, described by his neighbours as warm-hearted, friendly, and unfailingly polite. But what was perhaps even more shocking to the detectives was that he was one of their own, a police officer. In fact, he was a forensic specialist, a veteran of 30 years, and an expert in handwriting analysis. He worked here, in Saxony's State Office of Criminal Investigation, where he was also arrested on November 27th. As well as being a forensic specialist, Detlev ran this guest house with his partner. It was in an isolated settlement in eastern Germany's Ore Mountains, close to the Czech border. He led police there shortly after his arrest. It was now a crime scene, but even when it wasn't, it looked from the outside like the setting of a classic horror movie, and from the inside, it really didn't get any better. In the cellar was a homemade dungeon Detlev referred to as his S&M studio. It was decked with skeletal models, weapons, and a wrought iron cage. Here he is in that dungeon wielding an axe and wearing nothing but socks and sandals. I've cropped it for decency's sake. Socks with sandals are too much for anyone. When interviewed, Detlev was quite forthcoming. He gave them a full account of that day. It all began when he received a call from Wojciech. "Hello, your roast is ready to be picked up." Detlev collected Wojciech from Dresden's main train station, and they drove together through the snow-dusted Ore Mountains to the secluded guest house. According to Detlev, once there, they entered his dungeon. Detlev then gagged and bound Wojciech and strung him up with rope tied to a pulley system. He then killed Wojciech by slashing his throat, before collecting his blood in an old paint pot. Detlev spent the next 5 hours dismembering Wojciech's body, before burying his remains in shallow holes in the garden of his guest house. And every bit of it was consensual. Detlev had even made a disturbing home video of the dismemberment. Investigators who watched the 50-minute tape described it as horrific beyond belief. It shows Wojciech hanging from a hook inside the cellar. Detlev is covered in blood, cutting the bound and gagged man up into small pieces using a knife and electric saw, while pop music fills the dank air of the makeshift abattoir. At one point, Detlev stops to listen for a heartbeat, and throughout the tape he can be heard repeatedly muttering, "I never thought I would sink so low." An extensive excavation process began in the grounds surrounding the guest house. Numerous forensic investigators, dogs and heavy machinery spent days unearthing Wojciech's scattered remains. Then came the horrifying and painstaking process of trying to piece together his body. According to the medical report, Wojciech's probable cause of death was asphyxiation. but the condition of his remains made it impossible to determine this with any certainty. Detlev denied consuming any part of Wojciech, though his penis and one of his testicles were nowhere to be found. Why do they always eat that bit? Before his trial, Detlev retracted his initial confession and changed his story to say that Wojciech had hanged himself and that he'd only slit his throat and dismembered him after his death. This would of course warrant a lesser sentence. The trial began in August of 2014. Lawyers representing Wojciech's family sought a 15-year sentence for Detlev. They believe he murdered Wojciech and consumed his genitals. The prosecution told the courtroom he killed and dismembered him to get sexual stimulation, and then later to get sexual stimulation by watching the video he made. The shocked courtroom was shown the disturbing tape. Upon seeing it, Detlev broke down. He said the events of that day were a mistake, and that he was not a murderer. The judge told the courtroom that Detlev's expression of faint regret seen in the video showed it was unlikely he would ever repeat such an act. His defense pushed his second account of events, and argued that Detlev did not kill Wojciech, and he only took the knife and saw to him after he was already dead. They reminded the courtroom that Wojciech Stempniewicz had died willingly. Nonetheless, on April 1, 2015, Detlev Guenzel was found guilty of murder and disturbing the peace of the dead. Because there was no doubt that Wojciech had wanted to die, a life sentence was deemed unduly harsh, and Detlev was given 8 years and 6 months. Detlev appealed the sentence and the verdict was overturned. Following a retrial in 2016, he was again found guilty of murder and disturbing the peace of the dead. But in a dramatic turn of events, his initial sentence of 8 years and 6 months was deemed too lenient for a murder conviction. Instead, he was sentenced to 8 years and 7 months. Only slightly too lenient then. Detlev Guenzel is due to be released this year. What a bizarre story. It seems that Wojciech traded his life for nothing but the fleeting anticipation of death. And things are no less bizarre in this third and final story. We meet a woman named Susan, who, on the surface, has an ordinary suburban life. But her death, on the other hand, is anything but ordinary. Murdered twice. The third in this trinity of peculiar stories begins in Summit, a tidy blue-collar suburb of southwest Chicago. In one of its houses lived the Potempas, 56-year-old Robert and his 50-year-old wife Susan. The couple lived in this split-level home on a leafy Summit street for more than 20 years. By 1993 they shared it with their 2 young boys, Gerald and Stephen. They were well liked in the neighbourhood, always greeted people with a smile and a wave, apparently. But not everything was a bed of roses for the Potempa family. For the past year, Susan had been in and out of hospital as a breast cancer patient, which brings us to November 24th, 1993, the day before Thanksgiving. Robert was a huge fan of the Chicago Bears, so he took his sons on a 2-day trip to Michigan to see his team face the Detroit Lions in a Thanksgiving Day game. The Bears were triumphant, but Robert's happiness was short-lived. He and the boys returned home on the 26th, 2 days after leaving. When they opened the garage door, they made a devastating discovery. Susan was dead. Her battered body was lying on the garage floor in a pool of blood, her hands taped behind her back. It was evident she'd been struck over the head numerous times with a heavy electric drill, which was lying beside her. In the house itself, Robert found a series of ominous notes from his wife. They alluded to her upcoming death. She apologised for it, and bequeathed jewellery and other valuables to specific members of her family. An autopsy indicated that Susan had likely been lying there for 2 days. Her cause of death was recorded as strangulation and blunt force trauma to the head. Naturally, Robert was a suspect initially, but since he had a tight alibi that placed him almost 300 miles away, he was promptly in the clear. So police began to call Susan's murder a random act of violence, most likely the result of a brutal robbery. But a far more bizarre story was about to unfold. They received a phone call out of the blue about a week later. It was a man claiming his friend had admitted to the slaying of Susan Potempa. The new suspect was Reginald Williams. Reginald was 18 years old and on probation for an unrelated burglary the previous year. He'd already begun attracting attention to himself because of a recent shopping spree. He'd purchased a used car and expensive stereo equipment despite being unemployed. He lived just a few blocks away from the Potempas, but neither Robert nor his sons knew him. Investigators convinced the friend to wear a wire to see if Reginald would incriminate himself, and sure enough, he was caught on tape, admitting to killing Susan for money. Reginald Williams was arrested on December 4th, 10 days after the slaying, and was charged with Susan's murder. He admitted he'd been hired to kill Susan for the sum of $2,100, but who had paid him to brutally murder the mother of two? It shocked detectives to learn that it was Susan herself. According to Reginald, she wanted help ending her life because she was sick. And in his frank and detailed statement, this is what he said happened the day before Thanksgiving. After waving her two sons and husband goodbye, Susan promptly went shopping for her own killer. In broad daylight, she approached Reginald in the neighbourhood they shared. She told him she was looking for someone who would kill her for money because she was really sick. He agreed, and together they went inside the Potempa garage. There, as requested, Reginald strangled Susan. He then laid her body on the floor of the garage, took the $2,100 that was set aside for him, and then he left. Later that day, Reginald was hanging out with his girlfriend near to his own home, and he must have thought he'd seen a ghost when he was approached by none other than Susanpemper, very much alive. A few hours after he'd strangled her, she'd regained consciousness and had started driving around Summit looking for him to finish the job. As she combed the streets, several people directed her towards Reginald. They went back to the garage, Susan turned on the light, and together they began to brainstorm ways to end her life. A gun, suffocation with a pillow, but in the end she told him the best thing to do would be to strangle her until she lost consciousness again, and for him then to do whatever needed to be done to kill her. At her request, he bound her hands with duct tape so it would look like foul play. Then he choked her unconscious and picked up the nearest heavy object, the power drill, before hitting her over the head 7 or 8 times. According to him, he then dropped the drill and just stood there, shocked. And as we know, her bloodied body was discovered 2 days later. Police didn't believe a word of it. The thought that someone would pay to be murdered like that was absurd. But the more they spoke to her neighbours, the more plausible Reginald's story became. It seems she'd asked at least 4 neighbourhood men about arranging a murder in recent months. One neighbour said she'd approached him and asked if he knew anyone who would bump someone off. She didn't say who, but she did offer cash. Police now believed Reginald, but they were puzzled as to why no one had said anything sooner. Summit's police chief vented his frustrations. "I've seen murders for 36 years. I've seen bloodier and more gruesome murders, but never a murder like this with the for-hire aspects. And so many people had inklings of it and not come forward. I find it hard to believe that people would keep to themselves and not pick up the phone." But it left the question of why. Why would Susanpemper solicit her own murder? According to her family and friends, she was tired of suffering, of being a breast cancer patient, and to make matters worse, complications from an earlier mastectomy had left her racked with excruciating pain. It all led to severe depression. And so it appeared she'd waited until her family were out of town before acting on her desperate plan. But why she would choose such a violent way out was a mystery to everyone. There was heavy speculation that she wanted it to look like a murder so that her life insurance would pay out and her family would be taken care of financially. But police were adamant that there was no evidence for this. Nor was there any evidence that her family knew anything of the macabre plan either. In fact, Susan's husband didn't believe a word of it. He firmly believed his wife had been killed in a robbery attempt. He said he was an eye for an eye person, and he wanted Reginald to suffer the same pain he'd inflicted on his wife. I can only speculate that Robert believes the notes Susan left were referring to her illness. The case made headlines for highlighting the legal challenges surrounding suffering and consent. It was around the same time that headlines also featured Dr. Jack Kevorkian, the outspoken euthanasia advocate. But Reginald was facing up to 60 years for first-degree murder. He was offered a 28-year plea deal, but decided to take his chances at a trial in the hope of an acquittal. But at the 11th hour, he shocked everyone by changing his plea to guilty. Reginald Williams' sentencing hearing began in February of 1996, when the opportunistic killer was 20 years of age. During the hearing, a prosecutor described the man as a mercenary profiteering snake, and argued that the victim's willingness to be murdered was irrelevant. But his defence asked for the minimum sentence of 20 years because Reginald had no violent criminal history. The judge refused. He said, "To sentence Reggie Williams to the minimum would lend an acceptability to his actions, and I cannot do that." But there was a certain amount of leniency, because Reginald received a sentence of 26 years out of the possible 60. Robert Potempa was furious. Leaving the courtroom, he said he didn't think it was long enough. In a victim statement, he said, "My life is now lonely and sometimes meaningless. There is no one to share my closing years with. And there you have it, 3 very unusual, very different cases of consensual murder. All 3 sought death from a stranger. One chose it because of money, one because of pleasure, and one because of pain. Thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate every single one of you for being here. And I can't wait to hear your thoughts on these cases down in the comments. And hopefully I'll catch you again next time. Thanks again, and bye for now.